Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. It's great to have you with us. My name's Heaven Crawley. I'm director of the MIDEQ Hub. Welcome to this MIDEQ Share Out. I'm shortly going to just introduce our speakers tonight, but I just wanted to start by saying a little bit about MIDEQ and what we hope to achieve in the share outs. MIDEQ stands for Migration for Development and Equality. We're one of the world's largest migration research projects, and we focus specifically on the relationships between inequality, migration, and development in the context of the Global South. We're interested in both vertical and horizontal inequalities, so gender, age, and income, but we're also interested in more structural inequalities, if you like, inequalities that are associated with history, with the nature of contemporary capitalist neoliberal societies in which we live, and what that means for the experiences of migrants and the opportunities that they have or otherwise to migrate, and what happens to them when they do. So we're very interested in generating knowledge on those issues, but we're interested in particular in decentering the production of knowledge away from the global north, where most research on migration takes place, and towards the countries of the global south, where most migration takes place. And to that end, MIDEQ is made up primarily of researchers in the global south, more than 70 researchers in the 12 countries that we work. And we really are oriented as much towards the decentering of knowledge production as we are about the data itself. So what we're interested in finding out is how knowledge is generated around these issues as much as the issues themselves. And the purpose of the share outs is really to create opportunities for us to connect to others who are approaching their work in a similar way, even if it's on a quite different topic. So the topic of migration is our focus, but our approach, I think, is shared with other people. And it was really, I saw this particular book that we're going to be talking about tonight, the Decolonizing Politics and Theories from the Abya Yala. I saw this work on Twitter. I saw Fernando's tweet, downloaded the book, which he's going to be talking about. And it just felt very much that it connected with some of the work that we're doing in MIDEQ and some of the ideas that underpin our approach. And for that reason, it felt like it would be a good opportunity for us to connect and to see, to learn from one another and to see where we might explore these issues in different ways. So in terms of how we're going to structure the event this evening, I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, Fernando and Miguel, and they're going to speak for about 20 minutes each, both on the book. I think Fernando is going to very much introduce the book and tell us about its approach, how it looks at the history of the Abya Yala and what this means for the production of knowledge on various aspects of life in the Latin American context, and a whole range of different issues that we also engage with. So decolonizing social movements, issues of environmental crises and how they're represented. And once we've had their presentations, we'll then open up to you for discussion, for questions and answers, for reflections before we close at the end. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce our two speakers. I'll introduce them both at the same time and then hand over to Fernando in the first instance to say a little bit more about the book. So Fernando David Márquez Duarte is a Mexican decolonial activist and thinker from the Abya Yala. He has a BA in International Relations and an MSc in Regional Development. He's currently enrolled in a PhD in Political Science at the University of California in Riverside, which is where I think he's currently joining us from. He's got more than 5 years experience of teaching in different universities in Mexico and the USA, and he's currently teaching at UCR. His academic publications are in journals in Mexico, Brazil, Ecuador, Russia, Germany, and the UK, and he has book chapters in Mexico and Spain. He spent a lot of time working, advising and supporting Indigenous groups regarding Indigenous rights and political participation in the place where he currently works and I think elsewhere. And he's worked with the Resistance in Defense of Water in Baja California with a participatory action research project. So incredibly well placed to tell us about some of the work that's happening in the Abya Yala now. Miguel Alejandro Contrera is a Guatemalan sociologist from the Abya Yala as well, with an MSc in Governance and Development from Antwerp. And currently he's also a PhD student in Brazil. He's working also as a consultant researcher for Obesity Canada and has worked on topics relating to gender-based violence and structural, symbolic, and institutional violence in different contexts. So I think you'll agree it's a very interdisciplinary group that we have within MIDEQ, and we're delighted, therefore, to engage with other scholars who are coming at these topics or related topics to the areas that MIDEQ works in, but potentially from our perspective, from quite new and different perspectives. So I'm going to hand over to Fernando, and thank you both for making the time to be with us. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, Heaven. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So thank you for the space and to share this book. And also thank you everyone that joined to listen to us and hopefully to discuss with us about this project. So the idea is basically to kind of share the general aspects of the book, and then, you know, the justification and why this project came to be. And afterwards, I will just leave the voice to Miguel so he can talk about his chapter, which I found really interesting. And I'm really happy that he could join and be here with us. So without further ado, let me just share screen so you can see the PDF. In case you haven't read the book is available free online to view and download. I can just post the link right now in the chat so everyone can access it in case you haven't. So let me just, okay, chat. So I just posted the link in the chat. Anyways, going back to the book. So this is the cover of the book, and I want to talk a little bit about it because I chose this cover because of the meaning and the political statement that it represents. For those who don't know, this flag is the flag of the Wiphala. The Wiphala is the flag of that indigenous people, specifically the Quechua and the Aymara, adopted in Bolivia. And they have used it for the last 25 or more years in any political struggle and protest that they have led. And it has been so powerful that it has been adopted by other indigenous groups around the Abya Yala. And you know, and that's why I chose this image, and I think it very much represents the efforts of the book. And also I want to specify what Abya Yala means. Abya Yala, it's an idea in the Guna Puna indigenous language. The Guna Puna, depending on how you pronounce it, it's an indigenous group that is currently in what is now Panama and Colombia. It's between those countries. And in their language, Abya Yala can be translated into land in state of maturity or mature land. And it is a very well-known and very much used term in decolonial circles, and indigenous groups movements to refer to Latin America. So the colonial way to refer. So that's why the book is entitled Decolonizing Politics and Theories from the Abya Yala, because we want to use a term that is in line with our thought and our actions as decolonial scholars and activists. So yes, that's a little bit about the cover and the title. The book was edited by me and by Dr. Víctor Espinoza that couldn't make it today. He's really busy because he was recently named president of COLEF. He's a public research center in Mexico, where I studied master's degree. So yes, if you have any questions, you can post it in the chat or raise your hand. Yeah, but we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. And then, you know, I want to talk a little bit about why this book came to reality. So I have been studying my PhD in political science in the US since 2019. And what I have realized is that, you know, most of the academic work that it's discussed or analyzed in academia in the US, and basically that it's the same case in most of the Western countries, about Latin America, sadly, is not conducted or done by people from the Abya Yala or Latin America. So it's, I found it shocking, because how can people that have never lived in any country of the Abya Yala preach they are experts in the Abya Yala just because they have read about it? So, and I specified that being in Cancun for a week or two doesn't give you like the expertise to be an expert in the Abya Yala. So I thought we need to have an academic work about the Abya Yala that is written solely by people from the Abya Yala that are experts in the Abya Yala. So I pitched this idea to International Relations, which is the editorial house from the UK that published the book, and they were very interested. So I got Dr. Víctor on board, and that's how the project began. We began to publicize the call for papers, or for chapters in this case, and our condition was that we opened the call only for people from the Abya Yala or that are Latinx, right? And we especially encourage people from marginalized groups in the Abya Yala, which are indigenous groups and Black people, basically. So I'm very happy with the result. We got several chapters. Sadly, we couldn't accept all of them. And at the end, the result was to have 12 chapters in total. And it was, we didn't plan it that way, but it turned out that way, which I think it's fate. I don't know, it was destined to be, that 6 of the chapters are theoretical, more vastly theoretical, but the other 6 of the chapters are based on praxis. Because one of the most important things about decoloniality from the Abya Yala is focusing on praxis, right? You cannot say you're a decolonial scholar if you have never conducted anything in praxis, or your thought is not born from praxis. So, this is part 1, which is more theoretical discussions. And this is part 2, where Miguel's chapter comes into being. Is the first chapter of this part, actually. And I'm really happy to have, authors from very different countries. Miguel himself from Guatemala, authors from Mexico, authors from Brazil, from Colombia, what else? From Bolivia. And and also one very interesting thing, and I'm really happy to have that honor, is that we have Black authors and also Indigenous authors in our authors of the chapters, and you can read their bios, I think, at the end of the book, so you can check that there. And a really awesome thing that I'm really proud to presume is that I achieved that Aura Cumes, which is very prominent in the decolonial circle and in the feminist, communitarian, feminist, and indigenous circles, agreed to write the preface or the introduction. For those of you who don't know her, Aura Cumes, it's a Maya Cachiquel, I think, indigenous person from Guatemala. And she's both a scholar and an activist. She had her PhD in CIESAS, which is a public research center in Mexico. But she has dedicated most of her work from activism, not specifically from academia, but she has the academic formation. And she wrote the since her English is not that great, she asked us to translate the abstracts of the chapter. So what we did is that we translated the abstracts of the chapters and sent it to her in Spanish, and she wrote her preface or introduction in Spanish, and then we translated to English. But you can see actually the original version in Spanish in the book. So there's a link there in when you download the book, you can see it originally in Spanish, and it's a great preface. I'm really happy with the result, and it's very critical, which I appreciate. So that's, you know, a little bit about the generals of the book, and you know, this was just for you to know, the call for chapters or paper was published in February 2021. So, and the book was published on April this year, 2022. So this was a result of more than a year of work, of edition, and, you know, just gathering and making corrections to the chapter. So it was, you know, it was exhausting, but I'm really happy with the result. This is the first time I edit a book or a collective collection. So, and we have done some book presentations. I think this will be the third book presentation we have. And, you know, I'm just happy to share the results of it, and happy that we have so diverse range of approaches and cases, because as you can see in the contents, we have, you know, chapters from experience of specific countries, and then from South-South cooperation and international organisms, but from a decolonial approach that are very critical to those. And one of the things I was most focused on when choosing the chapters is that it was clear that they had a decolonial focus, and that it included decolonial authors. And in the corrections, I made sure that that reflected in the chapters, right? Because sadly, one of the things that happens in decolonial studies is that it is kind of a hot topic now. So everyone says decolonize this, decolonize that, but that doesn't imply what decoloniality implies, which is collectivity, cooperation against colonial oppression, which implies resistance against capitalism, colonialism, racism, misogyny, ableism. So I really work closely so the chapters reflected that. And I think they do. So, and I'm really happy with the result. And actually, very much related to this group is that we have one specific chapter about migration, which is the last chapter. So you might be especially interested in reading that, but all of them are great. We have chapters about cases of Indigenous peoples resistance, Indigenous people cosmovision, resistance against neo-extractivism and neo-colonialism, like Miguel's chapter that he will talk more about. And you know, the result, I think it's very rich, because readers can see a variety of decolonial approaches, but they can also see the intertwinedness and the importance of, let's say, activism or praxis in these approaches, and how these approaches can be used to rethink our societies and think of alternative futures that depart from current neocolonial capitalism, which is the system, neocolonial neoliberal, that we have around the world, sadly, and you know, and rethink assumptions about democracy and about development that doesn't have to necessarily be liberal representative democracy or economic development entirely. So yeah, I will leave it at that. I don't want to take more time of the presentation. And thank you for being here and for hearing me out. And yes, go ahead, Miguel.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Fernando. I will be talking about my chapter book. Let me share my screen with you. Okay. So, as you already heard, the crime of defending a river, domination, racism, and structural violence in Guatemala is a chapter part of this book. I am from Ishimuleo, also known as Guatemala, located in Abya Yala. But before I talk about a little bit of the case study that I developed in the chapter, I want to share with you the background behind this chapter, because this text is a collective effort that I made with some colleagues, Monica Aguilar, Max Castillo, and also with my sister Marielos Saquimux. In 2011, with Max and Monica, we started to think about what was the reason why the state of Guatemala didn't recognize the community consultations, even this were made following the legal Guatemalan framework. Because in Guatemala, there are 3 laws: the mines and energy law, the municipality law, and the electoral and political party law, that contemplate in their articles when people are able to call for community consultation if they are feeling affected by a national project. Even though between 2005 and 2011, more than 40 community consultations were conducted following this legal framework, the state of Guatemala didn't recognize it. And the main question was, why? And then we start to realize that one of the main findings was that the modern colonial rationality and the nation-state notions can frame the way the authorities and bureaucrats conduct their work and respond to the appealing of people trying to be heard by their own states. However, in 2018, with Max, we wrote the From Invisibilization to Criminalization paper, because we found that there was a policy state that at the beginning tried to invisibilize the community consultation processes and community political practices. And then when the state was unable to continue making visible this, start a criminalization processes targeting community leaders. So this is the result. The title was discussed with my sister, but because we understand that in the Guatemalan legal framework doesn't exist the crime of defending a river. However, the state and the companies, in this case, the Spaniard company that was trying to build hydroelectric plant in a river, they understand that they can appeal for a specific type of crimes to follow, to charge the community leaders. So where is the place that this case study took place is here, and this is the map of Guatemala. Guatemala is located in Central America, and in the northwestern area of Guatemala is located Huehuetenango, and in this northern area is where the Canjobal people lives. The Canjobal people are part of the 23 Mayan people that live in Guatemala. And I want to highlight this, that even though the nation state's rationality has imposed these names as the official names of these territories, the Mayan people still continue referring to these territories using the ancestral names. So Ishimule is to Guatemala, Chibanajul is to Huehuetenango, and Jolón Colob is not only Santa Cruz Varillas, that is this municipality. Jolón Colob is the territory of the Canjobal people that lives in San Mateo Ixtatán, South Eulalia, part of Nenton, part of Mexico, and part of the Ixcan municipality that is part of Quiché department. When I start to think about this main problem, I realized that racism and the racist violence against the Canjobal people was evident, and was evident not because we try to understand the violence actions against indigenous people as a direct actions that can hurt people. I started to think as a systemic and structural problem. And I rely on Galton, and Galton is, we can say, a Western theoric. But however, drawing in Galton theory, I realized that there were 3 moments of this racist violence against Canjobal people. As I said at the beginning, the invisibilization process started when the state of Guatemala didn't recognize the community consultation results that the Canjobal people conducted against the construction of the hydroelectric plant on a sacred river, the Cambalan River. And when the people was tired of waiting for a state response, they took a decision to have a civic resistance against the imposition of hydroelectric plant. So they tried to avoid direct violence with the policy or the army or the hydroelectric employers. However, in 2012, the former president, Pedro Molina, decreed a state of emergency in Santa Cruz Varillas. And this is why the beginning of the criminalization processes against the communitarian leaders. I also want to share with you that today in Guatemala, we are commemorating 10 years since the massacre in Totonicapán, perpetrated by the Guatemalan army, that in that time when the former president Otto Pérez Molina was in charge also. So I want to everyone here understand that I am not talking about that the racism against the Canjobal people is unique. No, it's part of a structural problem, and the racism against the Maya population in Guatemala is a huge, huge problem for everyone. So continue with the case study. When the criminalization processes started targeting people, it was evident that the structural violence had a change. And this change led me to ask me these questions that when I was doing this presentation, I remember that these 2 questions were the question that led me to this chapter, that what prevents us from understanding the dynamics of power and violence, and how do we understand violence? It is important to bear in mind this, because as Galton says, if the violence is the cause of something, what is behind of the violence? Why we continue reproducing or producing new ways of violence against a specific group, or even if we are not aware that we are doing that. This leads me to this next slide. When Galton was talking about how the modernization have shaped or worldviews or mindsets, and how we understand the realities, talking about or using the modern vocabulary and the Eurocentric theories to try to explain realities. When I start to work on this chapter, I was trying to figure it out how was it possible that racism exists and conditional social actions and political decision making. So relying on structural violence category, and following not only Galton's others authors such as Farmer and Bauer, but also adding the necropolitics theory that Michel Mbembe and Sayak Valencia have been working for more than 20 years. I understand how the foundational narratives create and frame our notions of reality and let us to replicate racist actions or racist ideas and oppression, and how it is possible to understand this in the case of the criminalization against Kanjova leaders. The state policy against the Kanjova leaders was to create two branches of criminalization. The first one, following the foundational narrative basis on racist ideas of the 19th century, start to say that the Kanjova leaders were dumb people because they are Mayans and they don't understand the notion of development, of progress, and they like to live in poverty. But at the same time, the state with the Spaniard company start to criminalize in the judicial system and start to say that these people were criminals. And why I say that racism is important, it's an important category here, because in the Guatemalan notions, if you can create the illusion that the a Maya person is against the status quo, this can be considered as a criminal. It's a criminal because it's attacking, the notion of nation, the notion of modernity, and also the notion of development. And how is possible that even though there were two different presidents, two different ministers of mines and energy, the decisions of the Guatemalan state were the same? It's because exists a foundational narrative that people are not willing to question it. And in this process is creating oppression against anyone who is against the imposition of mega projects that are hurting not only people, also the land where these people are living. And I also want to say here that we have to remember what the Charles Mill says about the race as a technology of power. Race as technology of power not only shape our point of view or mindset, it also shapes the conditions of life of people that are suffering racism. And this not only applies to racism, it's also sexism, xenophobia, among others. And we have to bear in mind that when I say domination, I am referring to the narratives that are creating and shaping the way that we understand our lives and our realities and the realities of others. However, if you are interested, you can read the chapter, but I don't want to lose this opportunity to share with you that the one most amazing thing that happened here is that the resistance of these the Kanjova people is that they were released and they were found not guilty of any of the charge that the company and the state was charging them. And I want to name them because it's important also that we know their names: Marcos Mateo, Esteban Bernabé, Diego Juan, Ventura Juan, Amado Pedro, Pedro Núñez, Joel Gaspar, Andrés León, Rubén Herrera, Rogelio Velázquez, Saúl Méndez, Adalberto Villatoro, Francisco Juan, Arturo Pablo, Maynor López, Ermitaño López, Rigoberto Juárez, Domingo Baltazar. They and their families, despite all the structural violence and racism that they have suffered, they persisted and they finally avoid the construction of the hydroelectric plant on the sacred river Campalan. So another thing that I want to say before I finish is the fact that I want to talk about that what is important to talk about from a critical stance using Western theories or categories. That firstly, we must think with the subject of knowledge rather than think for or their behalf. And we also have to create knowledge and not to apply standardized formulas or standardized theories that can give us the sensation that we are talking about something, as Fernando said at the beginning. It's important to read and to analyze theory, but also it's important to talk with the people who are living this kind of oppression and violence, and not try to talk on behalf of them. Is to talk what we can do with them and how we can create new ways of understanding and, in the best of the cases, new realities. And I also share with you this amazing photography of the day when the seven community leaders came back to their territory, and the Kanjobal people were very happy to receive them as a heroes. But also, this is an example of how the collective actions that are not in the Western notions can survive and can give us examples of how people are doing collective and democratic practices. So we can ask ourselves, who can be considered a citizen within violent dynamics of powers that deny identities and do not recognize historical and current political forms of social organization? And we also must address critical reflections on how we understand democracy and political participation, and whether this understanding is based on collective action or standardized institutional frames. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miguel. I really really enjoyed both presentations. Actually, they're very different but incredibly complementary. Just in Fernando, when you were talking about the production of the book, it felt very similar to the production of our recent Zanj. We did a Zanj special issue. All the contributions were from the partners in the Global South, and it was just very important for many reasons that we walk the talk of the decolonization, this idea of using this language of decolonization, but in fact, either kind of using it in a very extractive term to sort of take the privilege and the power that goes with theorizing decolonization, or doing this, continuing to do this process of extraction like the one you described, where you spend 2 weeks in Cancun and become an expert on the context, when clearly that's not possible. So I think this kind of this idea of extraction, but also kind of academic credentials and career building that's being done on the back of decolonization, when decolonization is a profoundly violent process and it's sort of been sanitized somehow by the academic discussion of it, certainly in the global north. And what you have both presented is a very different perspective on what decolonizing the knowledge looks like and the violence with which colonization is associated, not just historically, but in the contemporary context. And some of the things you talked about as well in terms of issues of language, you both talked about how language is both material and symbolic in terms of how we understand what's happening and why. I also, this idea of the sort of structural inequalities that you talked about, Miguel, and the kind of, again, the kind of deep-seated ways in which these inequalities are then reflected in the narrative, and how this narrative then reproduces those inequalities because it's operationalized by those in power in order to further marginalize those who have lost the power but still maintain their own power. And that photograph you showed, Miguel, of the power of that coming together of community, I think was a very explicit sort of indication of that. We have plenty of time for not just questions, but also discussion around some of these really important themes that you've raised. I have lots of things I'd like to talk to you about, but and actually, Miguel, hearing you talk about the chapter really brought it to life in a way that, I really enjoyed reading the chapter, but hearing about it was also, a different experience of it. So I want to suggest that other people might take some space first before I completely hog the discussion. You can either raise your hand or put something in the chat just to make a comment or reflection, or ask any questions, I guess, either about the production process and what that entailed, but also about the kinds of stories coming out of this and what they represent. So the floor is open for everybody else. Or the screen is open for everybody else. It's a very strange online world in which we live. Okay, we have a question, and I'm wondering whether you might read the question out, the person asking the question, if that's possible.
Sure, I can do that.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Sorry, I can't
No
pronounce your
problem.
name, so please tell me how to pronounce your name first.
Sure, the X is pronounced as an H, so it's
As an H,
Jimena.
okay.
Jimena.
Jimena, very nice to meet you, Jimena. Please ask your
Nice to
question.
meet you too. Yeah, I really liked this presentation and the whole premise of the book and the need and the motivation to do the book. But obviously we know that there is limited amount of research happening and about the experience of racism from the perspective of the global South. And so I'm wondering, what can we do to help encourage and support more research in this area in the global South? Other than, I know Fernando mentioned a few things, like you provided translation for one of the authors that wrote a chapter in your book, but how can we actually support the research that Miguel was talking about in terms of, writing, like talking to the people who are experiencing the racism at the local level and really capturing that perspective? Because I think it feels like very strange to send, Western researchers down to Guatemala to capture that experience. It would be better if Guatemalan researchers do that research in their own communities. So how do we support that? What can we do to support more Guatemalan researchers doing research on the Guatemalan experience of racism? Does that make sense, Miguel?
Yeah,
My
sure.
question?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit tricky and difficult at the same time because Guatemala is one of the poorest countries in America, and we don't have any kind of research funds. So we depend on, in Guatemala mainly, is the US university who supports or funds research. But the problem is that these universities just hire the US citizens or researchers to conduct this kind of research, and they are trying to work with the local communities, but at the same time they are not willing to question themselves about how these unequal relations between the Western researcher and the local researcher and the way that we are thinking and understanding our realities affect the research results. So I think that the first thing that we have to be aware is that in Latin America it's very difficult to conduct research by ourselves because we don't have funds. And the other thing is that we expect that the universities of research centers that have the money to fund these researchers, they always criticize themselves too, and to be aware that they also need to change some ways of work that normally we don't discuss. And I think that we have to start to talk more about the relations between the so-called global North and global South researchers.
Thanks for the question, Jimena, and the response. I think certainly in MIDEQ, we, with the issue of resources, the fact that most of the funding comes from the North, but you can still do other things with it in our experience, but the funder still holds the power. So for example, last year when there was the ODA funding cuts in the UK, so the reduction of development assistance to the Global South, this is where our funding comes from essentially. We took a £6.2 million hit on our budget because basically it wasn't a priority for the funder to prioritize not just our research, but a whole group of other projects that were funded by that funding stream. So even if you try to decenter the production of knowledge, the power often is attached to the funder. And so they, in some ways, can still exert the final power, which is to take away your money, not just if you're not complicit, but or comply with what they want, but if they just change their priorities, essentially, it becomes sort of very political indeed. So yeah, we can really relate to that. Faisal, you've got your hand up. Hi, Faisal, you're on mute, but I can see you've got your hand up. Oh,
Hi,
we can hear you now, yeah.
my network is a bit patchy.
I can hear.
Can hear. No, thanks a lot for the presentations. I really exciting. Saw the free PDF and so I just have to similar process.
Faisal, you're very in and out. I don't think we can hear your question because we're hearing every third word.
My location and
Okay.
Or he can just put it in the chat if that's
I'm thinking
better,
too, but
so
yeah.
we don't miss the question.
Sure.
I wanted just to also answer the
please.
question, even if it wasn't to me. So besides what Miguel mentioned, that I think it's accurate, you know, just thinking that and rethinking what is research, right? How we conduct research, because even like this is especially salient with researchers from Western countries that come to global South countries, but it is also, you know, pretty common in researchers from our own countries to conduct research in a way that it's, you know, very vertical, very hierarchical, and not really collaborative. So, you know, we have to favor more or like make a transition, more of a transition to more projects of action, research, participatory action research that are so important, because that allows the communities to be co-researchers in the production of knowledge and to even define the goals of the research, which is very important, and prevents what sadly happens a lot, which is extraction and exoticization of marginalized groups. That's what I have tried to do in my research, to work with the groups, not to study them because they are not animals, and to work collaboratively, and if possible, make them co-authors in this publication. And also, you know, open more the academia to not only academics or scholars, but people that have no graduate degrees, or maybe they don't even have an undergraduate degree, but they are activists and they are, you know, experts in their field, from the field. So I think those things are very important to value and to incorporate. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
That's great. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was, Miguel, I really like this slide that you had about, you know, where you discussed the racism and how that, you know, how the government really supported the creation of these damaged identities for Indigenous people, you know, promoting the stereotypes that, oh, Indigenous people are not intelligent, they don't want to have modernization, as a way to really impose their own colonial laws and practices. But how specifically did the community address this damaged identity, all these stereotypes that, you know, they're not smart, they're against modernization? How did the Indigenous community resist that narrative and address those damaged identities that the government creates in Guatemala?
Well, there are several ways that the communities are addressing this. And in the recent years, after the genocide and the civil war that Guatemala has had in the 20th century, currently there are many communities, Mayan peoples, talking by themselves, and also pointed out the necessity, that is a necessity to challenge our point of views. And they are demonstrating that without them in Guatemala, many people never will have access to food or to the notions of realities beyond the modern way that we know around the world. And one of the examples is, for example, that I have now in mind is a project that is named Patsum, and Patsum is located in the center of Guatemala. And this is a collective action that is working on how the food and land and the cosmogony are knowledges that can shape new ways of surviving now that we are facing climate change, and how the food knowledge that came from the mothers or the grandmothers are also important in the way that we understand our realities, and is facing this stereotype against indigenous people that and it's important that you mention it, that there are two ways in Guatemala. First, indigenous is related to dumb people. And two, if you are indigenous or Maya in this case, you are a criminal. So with these actions that people are telling, we are not anything that you are talking about us, is also creating new ways of understanding that also creates a conflict among the mestizo people that they don't feel represent in these new ways of knowledges that are arising. Sorry, no new knowledges, ancestral knowledges that are being raising in the last 30, 40 years, and that now many people have to think how to refer to indigenous peoples in Guatemala. And this is one of the most important things that I can consider that in Guatemala, at least we have advanced, that compared to the South American countries, in Guatemala is less visible, the racism. It's less visible, but exists as in the South America.
Thanks, Miguel. It feels like, although it's these kind of marginalized, these ways in which narrative serves to marginalize feels very similar to some of the work that we're doing in relation to migrant groups in different contexts. I mean, the ways in which these narratives are constructed, often deeply gendered, but certainly around the criminalization, the sort of security agendas, the lack of a simultaneously unable to contribute and stealing jobs. These narratives are very powerful in shaping kind of not just the political responses, but the way in which the narratives then shape the material consequences for people who are living in these different contexts that we're working in. So it feels similar in some ways, the ways in which these categories serve to marginalized and get reinforced by the narrative process. So thank you. Swami, I think you had a question for us, or a point. Hey, nice to see you. I wish people put their videos on all the time. It's so nice to see actual faces.
I know, it is fun. Hi, everyone. Miguel and Fernando, thank you for such a great presentation and for such a great book. I need to.
Hard copy.
It is very good. Congratulations for the work that you've been doing. It's amazing. And I want to hear a bit more about the point of view that the two of you have. I'm from Guatemala and I live in Canada. So I have that knowledge and experience of how we've been working about decolonization. And when we integrate, sorry, I want to be a bit sarcastic here, but when we integrate all the intersectional and inclusion, right? So all this process working from the North, my experience, but I don't have that experience from the academic perspective. And the two of you have this experience working and living. And my understanding is that you are in North America and you did both master's degrees as well in the Western world. So it's all this process of the identification of racism that is included in the academic and who holds the power, right? It's because what we are seeing, who holds the power, who holds the knowledge. My area of work is especially in gender equality and working with women, and who holds the power and who works in that narrative most of the time is WHO and the UN and all the academic as well. But this doesn't mean that it is working on all the process of decolonization that we need to actually start working among with the people in Central and South America, right? And I will say this as well for Asia and different African countries. So from your perspective, what you could talk about that's racism from the Western countries that is integrated already and is not talking about in a very open way, and how this dialogue, I will say, from the academia, it will help to continue the process of decolonization in the South.
Great question. Fernando, Miguel, which one of you wants to go first?
You want to go first, Miguel, or you want me to go first?
Oh, you're on mute.
Go ahead, Fernando. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I agree with you, Swami, that you know, there is a lot in the last years in the US at least. I just wanted to clarify that I studied my undergrad and my master's in Mexico, not in the US. I only studied my PhD in the US. There is a lot of like diversity and inclusion frameworks and intersectionality frameworks that for me are just putting a veil on a structural oppression and in the structural neo-colonial oppression that it has been perpetuated all over the world by the empires and afterwards by, you know, the elites that are basically transnational companies together with the political elites of these Western countries. And, you know, and it's very salient in academia how they say, oh, like, for example, where I study PhD, they say, oh, we are at a Hispanic serving institution, which the term Hispanic is extremely problematic. But anyways, but they don't really care about the Latinx students or you know, oppressed groups. And and it's obvious that we are at a disadvantage compared to you know, people that have U.S. citizenship, and especially people that are white, right? And this work from the top positions of the universities to supposedly reach more inclusion and diversity, I think it obscures the real problem, which are the structural problems of opportunities and inequality. And if I extrapolate that into the nation state in general, this framework of inclusion, it's the new word for assimilation, which was the scheme that was used to control indigenous peoples and take from them their land and their power, and in several cases their life. Because when you use inclusion, diversity, and assimilation, you don't really allow for real self-determination of these groups to happen, right? And yeah, I just wanted to mention that. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I can tell you. Go ahead, Miguel.
Yeah, this in the academia is a problem because it doesn't matter where you are located. The academia world is very, I don't know how to say it, like a jail sometimes, because people are not willing to question themselves. It's like I have the power because I have the knowledge, and I am the person who have the possibility to say what is true or what is not. And in the social science, this is not possible anymore. We have to be aware that there are processes, historical processes behind us that are questioning the ways that the Western visions and the modern rationality has framed our worldviews. It's very hard at the moment when we are trying to figure out who is the subject of the study, if the subject is also the researcher, because in social science we have to remember that we as researchers, we are part of the problem that we are researching, and we also have to be aware that we have to continuously questioning ourselves, why I'm using this category, why I'm using this concept, why I'm taking this path and not this one, and why I'm feeling afraid to not get funds if I am talking about this phenomenon, and I'm not continue talking about this because this is the trendy thing. So I think that the academia had to think more about what it's doing inside before start to continue talking about the social phenomena outside the academia world.
Yeah, I think many of us would agree with that assessment, even those in, you know, relatively privileged positions of power and stability in permanent posts. I mean, you're constantly operating in a world where there's an expectation that you're largely not understandable to most people. That's where the power comes from. You know, the knowledge is power because you can kind of create this illusion somehow that you're more clever or more able to understand these issues that people that actually live in those contexts and understand those issues entirely, which I think was Fernando's point. You know, people do research and spend a couple of weeks in a context and expect to know it. And yet you couldn't imagine, for example, anybody, you know, from the global south coming to a country like the UK or the US and doing research on those cultures and those contexts and being able to be perceived as being legitimately able to speak about those things in a couple of weeks. But that happens all the time with global north researchers. We see it happen all the time. I'm seeing some things coming up in the chat. Do people want to say these things rather than chat them so that everybody can hear? Miriam, you put your hand up, so the screen is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. Congratulations, Fernando and Miguel. My name is Miriam. I'm also Guatemalan. And just because of the question that, I don't remember her name, Swami did, I was remembering that there are some efforts of decolonial feminists and decolonial indigenous peoples that are working on recovering orality as a valid way of scientific knowledge rather than only text and publishing articles, for example, in journals, which is only accessible for privileged people. No? You have to pay for an article to be published. In the knowledge, for example, no? And the knowledge that our ancestors or indigenous populations are having is always lost due translation sometimes, and because you know, academic knowledge leaves them on the margins. So what I'm trying to say is that there are already ways of building knowledge in other ways, and we have to pay attention to it and also to learn of those efforts. And I think orality is a good form and a good way of showing us that. You know? It was just only a comment, and congrats again.
I agree with you, Miriam, and actually Aura Cumes, for me, is one of those people that it's one of the pioneers of communitarian feminism or indigenous feminism, and she's indigenous herself. So, and she works more in activism than in academia because of all of the barriers that we have discussed, right? And yes, and also the fact that people that have not the acceptable academic credentials are normally marginalized from journals, publication, or whatever. And about the cost, yeah, it's ridiculous that they charge people to publish and that charge people to read. Like, do they really think that people will pay to read these papers? Like, most times nobody cares about academic readings. And that's why I like to work with this editorial house, since they don't charge anything to the authors of the book or the editor, and it's open access. So you know, I have like a policy to publish only in open access journals, or try to publish only in open access journals, not so that they don't charge me because I don't have the money. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that. Thank you for that comment.
Thanks, Fernando. I think this issue of open access is really important. It's the reason I just posted the link to the Zanj special issue. I mean, the Zanj Journal of Critical Global South Studies, it's not a high-ranked journal. I think they've only had a couple of issues published in the last 5 years. But we chose that journal partly because of what it represented politically, but also because, you know, in terms of getting our work read, in terms of getting access to people getting access to our work and us being able to engage with different audiences, having open access is the only possibility. You know, 15 articles at whatever the article processing charge is, which is normally about $2,500. You know, you're looking at sort of, you know, ridiculous amounts of money, not just to publish, but for people to access it. And what's the point of producing knowledge if no one can actually read it? So I think you're completely right, Fernando. Strategically, you have to make a choice that it's not about the academic citation index or anything else. It's about production of knowledge purposefully and politically, because knowledge is power. So if we're not prepared to make our knowledge accessible, then we're just reinforcing this kind of elitist idea that only some people have access to the knowledge, essentially. So I'm just trying to keep an eye on the chat, which I think a few people have made comments about open access. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in academia, that's seen as somehow making some sort of sacrifice for your academic career. But I think, as others have said, academic careers are not just about climbing up in academia. They're about engaging with the world in which we live and that we want to engage with meaningfully. So, Faisal, I can see you're still there, but I don't know whether you want to try again at your question and see whether it works this time. Maybe, or if not, maybe put it in the chat, depending on your connection. I don't even know if Faisal can hear us. Maybe not.
I was gonna say the whole idea that we've moved, academia has changed so much, where we have to publish in these top journals and have to pay, is completely contradictory to what, you know, research is about. Like, the whole idea of research is doing research so that we can change and produce new knowledge that can improve our lives. And then now it's like a business, like the whole power, well, exactly. The whole model seems wrong.
Exactly. I mean, you've got kind of parallel trends, haven't you? Because certainly in the UK and most of Europe, there's this kind of focus on impact and engagement. There's this very linear narrative that somehow if you produce something and talk to a policymaker, it's somehow going to change how things are. I mean, this is deeply political, and I think academia is in that sense part of the neo-capitalist system, right? Neoliberal system. It's the consumption of knowledge for purposes other than change. I think that's probably true to say.
Yeah. So then would you say that it wouldn't make sense then to, I mean, like, because I was saying maybe we need more regional journals that are published in the language of the communities that are doing the research in those countries. But then are we then bringing that Western model of publishing research to, and that's the same thing that we're trying to avoid. So I'm like, I don't know if that's helpful.
There are lots of journals in many contexts in the global South, but I think they are, as you say, set up on the same model and largely perpetuated, to be honest. The other thing about language is very interesting, because in our Zanj special issue, we were very lucky with Zanj, and you should definitely use Zanj if you want to do anything that's open access. This is Zanj originated from the Walter Rodney Foundation. It's very much underpinned by Walter Rodney principles, and they, for example, we have poetic contributions, we have short and long contributions, we can produce contributions in any language. But it was interesting that in the end, with the exception of one article, everybody chose to write in English, even though they primarily worked in another language, because in terms of academic progression or even getting your work read, they felt that actually it would be better to publish in English. But I seriously recommend Zanj as a journal if you want to publish open access, and if we want to build Zanj as a journal of critical global South studies, then I think it's a really potentially a very good place to publish. So, because it has lots of flexibility over how you publish and what kind of publications you want to make. Maria Rosa, you've come on camera. Does that mean you want to say something? Good, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I have a question. It's a bit more general on the concept of decolonization. In particular, the question is related to how is it interpreted and perceived by the community. My question comes from a specific perspective, that is my experience in South Africa during the movement Fees Must Fall, that raised in 2016 and went on for 3 years with a really important political movement generated by the students of the university to give free access to university to everybody, as more or less summary of the situation, a bit more than that, but that's a summary. The point about decolonization is that decolonizing the culture and the way of producing knowledge and being academics at the university created along the time a disruption inside the movement itself. Inside the movement, there were different groups. There was the feminist group, there was the LGBTQ+ group, there were what became later on Black Lives Matter group. So all these different groups were part of Fees Must Fall. It was important to be together, to fight for something we all agree. Eventually, we were not agreeing on the same things because decolonization was not really perceived in the same way. What is your experience? Have you had something similar from the point of view of the communities, and what is their perception of what is decolonization? Thank you.
Great question. Fernando?
Thank you for that question, Maria. And so I just want to make a clarification, but that's just disclaimer that that's my personal point of view. Decolonization is different than decoloniality. Decolonization, like even if we take it solely the etymology of the word decolonization, it's a process that it's like a point and that's it. It's a very limited process in time, and it's normally used to refer to when colonized countries achieve their formal independence. That, as I think, that didn't really did much to break or emancipate from the colonial oppression. It just turned a neo-colonial oppression. But anyways, and decoloniality, on the other hand, is the word that I prefer to use more, just because even etymologically, it's a continuous process, right? It's a process that we have to work continuously, where it's about fighting against the structures that were imposed and have perpetuated since the colonial invasion. That, if we quote Aníbal Quijano, for example, and other authors like Frantz Fanon and Paulo González Casanova and several others, there was a structure, a colonial structure imposed, composed of coloniality of power, coloniality of being, coloniality of knowledge, and coloniality of mother nature, which basically left a specific state-nation structure based on the European models, a specific hierarchization of being of who's superior, white, male, rich people from Europe, and all the others at the bottom, and especially, indigenous and Black people at the bottom, especially women, and especially if they have like a disability or something else, right? So all of these things compose what Quijano and Catherine Walsh call the colonial matrix of oppressions that have continued even after the formal independence of the countries. They just turn a new face, as Frantz Fanon says. So decoloniality is this process that we have to continuously exercise collectively. I think that's the key, collectively and structurally. Because I have seen a lot of people say, oh, decolonize clothing, and they just make funny designs, but the production is capitalistic still, and it's not equal. So that's not decolonizing. That's just marketing, right? And that's what we have to fight against. To be very cautious in how we use it, and how not only we preach it from our mouth, like in Spanish we say dientes para afuera, which I don't know how to translate in English, just discourse, right? No, we have to put our money where our mouth is, to live by it, and not individually, because they say decolonize your mind. Well, yeah, but if you don't work with others and collectively work with other causes, as the example of Maria said, to find a common cause, to fight against a common oppression, then we won't achieve a real structural change that is very much needed, right? Like Enrique Dussel talked about what he called hegemonic vindication, or in Spanish, reivindicación hegemónica, which is, you know, there are different oppressed groups that have different identities and different causes, but for sure, let's find some common cause where we can unite against the oppressor, which is global elites that perpetuate neo-colonial capitalist oppression. So that's what I can say. Sorry if I get fired up, but it's a very important thing for me. And I don't know, Miguel, you want to add something?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Fernando. And yeah, when we talk about decolonization, we have to bear in mind that we are talking about collective processes. It's not an individual approach, and it's not also about that the LGBTQ community fighting for the rights and the women fighting for their rights. We have to understand this as a collective, that we are living in a collective processes, and we need to respond in a collective way. It's not only that if I am feeling affected by some colonial rationality, I will fight it. It's like, even if I am not feeling affected at all, I have to raise the voice, and not raise the voice because I think the people is not capable. I raise the voice in the spaces where I live, where I occupy, and making sense that if we continue reproducing these logics in my space, I will continue reproducing violence in others. So we have to think that the coloniality is a collective process that responds to historical demands, not current demands only.
Thank you both. I think that's very helpful. Faisal, going to have another try. You're in a better place.
Hi, and everyone. Greetings. Thank you very much once again for the presentation and the fascinating conversation. So 2 quick points. Fernando, I was closely listening to the choices you had to make in terms of who you invited to contribute to the book. I think this is really an important conversation. So I am on the editorial board of a journal called Global Africa. It's a fairly new journal, publishes in Swahili, Arabic, French, and English. And we have been having a debate, for example, around the question of citing scholars. Let's say I go to Zambia, for example, and do some work on urban informality. And the question we ask ourselves is, am I engaging with the works of scholars based in Zambia, right? Now, one way to ask that question is, am I engaging with Zambian scholars? But we said, no, we're not. Our starting point is location, right? To say what kinds of debates is a person involved in, and what kind of outlook do they bring to bear, given their location, okay? So for us, the point is location as opposed to other criteria. And I think the point that you make is really important because it shows the historical specificities and how one responds to things based on historical specificities. Now, the second quick point I want to make is around what I think is an important conceptual difference that Fernando makes between decoloniality and decolonization. Now, here on the African continent, I have to say, there has been a slight pushback against decoloniality. People like Sabelo, Gacheni, and co lead, the decoloniality debate here. But there is a pushback because of what indigenous and native mean in the African context. These were and still are political identities that colonialism uses as a way to fix what are called quote unquote tribes. So shifting identities were made fixed, and certain people were seen as indigenous, tribal, and native to certain places. And so if decoloniality in a sense draws on particular ideas about indigenous and knowledge, indigenous ways of thinking, and of course the central critique of capitalism is important. For proponents of the pushback, the danger is a certain freezing of identity. Instead of seeing this shift, then we harken back to the way in which colonialism functioned in Africa. So I'm just trying to say there's really something rich in what you're saying, but when I also look at the context here, it just shows why context is really important in these debates, and why conceptual clarity is very, very necessary instead of just banding them around. So I really appreciate the way in which you clarify this, but I thought I would add the context here and how this pushback against decoloniality and in favor of decolonization plays out here. Thanks.
That's really interesting, Faisal. Thank you. I'm conscious of time. Fernando and Miguel, do you want to just, I don't know if you have any kind of reflections on that context point from Faisal? So
I have to leave like in 3 minutes, so I will just be very brief. Thank you, Faisal, for that comment, and I agree that context is really important, and how and why the justification of this book is important, like to hear our voices, that we know the context, and also to acknowledge our reflexionality and reflexivity and positionality. That's why I always say that the objectivity of knowledge is a fallacy. There is no such thing. There is only acknowledging it or ignoring it. And it's important to acknowledge it and understand that people from a community obviously are the most, should be the most authorized voice to talk about it, because they have lived it and they have suffered and they know the context from reality, not from a book, right? But yeah, and that's why context is so important, and I would really like to keep talking about with you, Faisal, about decoloniality and how in different contexts mean different things. But yeah, thank you, everyone. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you, Fernando. I know you've got to dash. I can see one more point in the chat from Ulia. I don't know, Ulia, if you want to make the point or whether we could just read it in the chat, depending on time. But I think we're running out in any case. But listen, this has been a really interesting conversation. I'm so glad we had this opportunity to chat about not just the content of the book, but the kind of approach that you're taking and how it kind of speaks and resonates with some of the things that we're trying to do within MIDEQ. And I really hope that there'll be other opportunities for us to engage with one another around some of these issues. We have our partners in Brazil, obviously our Haitian partners too. And if there are possibilities of us kind of not necessarily collaborating directly on something, but continuing to share these ideas, because I also think it's about building a collectivity across these different contexts that takes account of the kind of nuances that Faisal was talking about, but also really goes in depth, in real detail to the historical and geographical specificity of different places. So thank you both very much for your presentations and for engaging such an interesting conversation. And thank you also to Bendu and to Cynthia, of course, for organizing the event. We'll publish, we'll send out some links about the book to try and direct some traffic towards it. Also, if you want to engage with our Zan special issue, we'd really be interested in the sort of shared ideas around this. So thanks to everybody for being here, and we hope to see you again soon at another event. Thank you all.
Thank you. Gracias.
Bye-bye.